Hello everyone, Mr. Lapeze here with a brief review of our first essay prompt with a little brainstorming just to help get you started. And I'll try to make a video like this for every major assignment this semester, and usually I make one for the final exam projects as well. So first thing, this is your essay number 1 prompt. You'll find this in Blackboard, multiple places. Many of you have already seen it. And I usually tell my students there's 3 really important bits of information, I think, from the get-go as soon as you look at it. One is how much is the assignment worth? And you see right here, it's worth 15%. That's 15% of your full semester grade. So in English 111, we have 15% for the first essay. The second essay is worth 20%, and the third essay is worth 25%. So we scale up with each assignment. So first, how much is it worth? It's worth 15% of your course. Next, very important bit of information is the due date. Your essay is due by Saturday, September 7th at 11:59 p.m. I usually tell my students I would not wait for the last minute or two to submit. You don't have to submit days ahead of time or weeks at a time, but if you wait till the last minute, you have some sort of failure of technology, that's a problem. So September 7th at 11:59 p.m., the due date. And then what is the assignment? For my essays, I put the prompt in bold and underlined right in the middle of the page like this. And so for this paper, the approach is a definition. There's lots of different approaches: cause, effect, problem, solution, compare, contrast. This one is a definition paper, and I'm asking you to define the term salvation. That's the gist of the essay. Over 3+ pages, you can define that term salvation. And then specifically within your definition, I'm asking you to consider various forms of the salvation, such as earthly salvation, spiritual salvation, and perhaps even superstitious salvation. And I'll explain what that means in a second. The other part, there's some reminders, some guidelines, and there's a revision checklist on this document. The only other thing, those are pretty self-explanatory. The only other thing I think you might want to consider are these questions. These are just questions to consider I post beneath the essay prompt itself. And my take on these is that you don't need to answer specifically any of these. These are just really to get the juices flowing. If you find yourself looking at the essay prompt and you're like, I get it, but I don't really know how to start. Or you find yourself in the middle of like page 2 and you're like, man, I need another 1.5 pages. What am I going to think of to write? I already think I wrote everything. Come visit these questions. They might help you generate ideas. So that's what these are for. The prompt right here: define salvation, and then consider various forms such as earthly, spiritual, and superstitious. So I wrote some notes on another document, and I'll post these. These will be posted with this video. And this is where I would get started. If you're going to define a term, start with the very simplest, most basic definition of what the term means. So salvation basically means to be saved. It's an act of being saved. That's what an act of salvation is. And then from there, I would consider what that act entails. What does it consist of? And if you're going to be saved, if a person or a thing will be saved, usually there's something they save from, and that would be a threat. And there's something that does the saving, and that would be the savior. Sort of like the genesis of this assignment is that there's words and phrases that just become associated just by use. Nothing nefarious, and there's no sort of secret message behind it, but just words and phrases become co-opted by people and groups, and that's very normal throughout human civilization. Salvation is something many of us immediately associate with religion and spirituality. And so what I want us to do with this assignment is define the term salvation, considering that exists for sure. The word salvation has a spiritual application, but it also has other applications. And so I want us to explore the full definition of the term salvation. And so in the prompt, I ask you to consider at least a few different variations of salvation: earthly and spiritual, and perhaps even superstitious salvation. So what does that mean? You write your paper, you start with your introduction paragraph, and then your thesis statement. Usually it'll be within your introduction paragraph. For a definition paper, it will be your definition, a specific, usually 1 to 2 sentence definition of the term salvation. And that's your thesis. It directly responds to the prompt. And then from there, everything that follows in the body of your essay should be directly linked to that thesis statement. So let's say your thesis statement says something like salvation is blank or means blank, and there are various forms. There's earthly, there's spiritual, and superstitious, and they are similar and different in these ways. That's your thesis statement. Your body paragraphs, or however many there are, will explore all the implications of your thesis. So earthly salvation, what does that mean? It means basically not spiritual. It means of the earth, things that you can touch, you can feel with your senses. And so threats within the earthly salvation realm, what would they consist of? Things like a house fire or a rip current or a hurricane, or things that aren't quite so natural disaster related. Addiction, depression, a virus, a cold. These are things that threaten our earthly existence as people. They harm us physically, they harm us emotionally or psychologically. So that's examples of earthly threats. Earthly saviors would be sort of like what counteracts those threats. First responders, friends, families, nurses, physicians, medications, vaccines, masks, seatbelts, anything that serves to counteract those physical earthly threats and potentially be saviors, and an example of an earthly salvation. Different than earthly would be spiritual. These are things that are supernatural, and often they require faith or belief without the existence of any sort of evidence. And so examples, things like in Christianity, people consider threats like eternal damnation or eternal punishment. Many religions consider some sort of devil or hell or demon as a spiritual threat. And then the saviors in those spiritual examples would be the higher powers or the angels or angelic figures or prayer or chants or incantations, things that you can do and entities you can pray to or hope to intercede on your behalf to save you from these spiritual threats. And you can see the difference already between an act of spiritual salvation and an act of earthly salvation. Quite a difference between a first responder saving you or someone from a house fire and a higher power saving someone from eternal punishment. They're similar, but they are quite different. And then I ask you in the prompt to consider, where does superstition fall along this spectrum of earthly and spiritual salvation? Where do things like the threats, like just bad luck or bad karma, or an issue you have without any logical explanation? You don't know exactly what the threat was or what caused it, but it's a problem. And for saviors, things like a lucky pair of socks or a lucky penny, or a rabbit's foot or a horseshoe. Where do examples like superstitions, where do they fall along the earthly and spiritual salvation spectrum? Because as you can tell already, they have sort of a spiritual component. You know, for example, athletes are notoriously superstitious. Let's say you're an athlete, you're a soccer player, and you have a lucky pair of socks. And you wear those socks for your first game of the season, and you win. Your team wins. And you're like, I'm not washing these socks. I'm wearing these every game throughout the season. And you wear them, and your team goes undefeated and wins the state championship. That seems like it has something of a spiritual component to it. It's not quite the same, you might argue, as a sort of formal religion. But it also doesn't, there's no logical explanation, like in the examples of earthly salvation, where someone takes medication and the cold goes away, the virus is killed and the person is healed. That's logical. It can be explained by science. Superstition, I think, falls somewhere along a spectrum between the two. And so what I'm asking you to do is consider Where does it fall? Is it more spiritual than earthly? Is it an exact combination of the two? Because these saviors are pretty earthly, right? You can hold a rabbit's foot in your hand. You can hold a lucky penny. You can put on your socks and look at them and smell them and all that sort of thing. So there's earthly components, but there's also this sort of inexplicable place where luck and bad luck seem to exist. So this would make for an interesting paragraph, I think. And then finally, I have some questions that I think would make for interesting critical thinking exercises and probably a good paragraph or two. So where do the different types of salvation basically overlap? Can a spiritual threat, something like a demon or hell or a devil or sin, ever be overcome by an earthly savior? Something like a friend or a parent or a first responder even? And if so, how is that possible? And if not, why not? Can an earthly threat, something like a house fire, a rip current, addiction, depression, those types of earthly threats to our well-being, can they be overcome by a spiritual savior? And this is something we see lots in pop culture and movies and books, and this is throughout history too. Even for people who aren't necessarily spiritual, you might find yourself, a person might find themselves having not been spiritual for years and years and years, or maybe never, and they get in a car accident and they're trapped in a car and the car bursts into flames and they are praying, please, somebody, God, somebody help me get out of this alive. Why? Is that possible? Is it possible? How could it be possible? Why or why not? How can an earthly threat like that car accident with the fire be overcome by something that is spiritual, that basically relies on faith to exist? And then similar types of questions. What are the similarities and differences between earthly and spiritual threats? And then how are saviors in the spiritual and earthly realms similar and different? Where does a Judeo-Christian God compare and overlap with a first responder or a physician or a nurse? And how are they different? Same thing for the threats. So that's the gist of the essay. And I usually say, once you get your introduction, you engage your audience, you have a thesis statement that directly responds to the prompt and specifically defines the term salvation. Between breaking down threats and saviors for earthly, spiritual, and superstitious salvation, you usually will have somewhere between 3 and 6 body paragraphs. And that should easily get you to that 3 full pages. That's the minimum requirement for essay number 1. So brief brainstorming exercise. Like I said, I'll try to do this for every major assignment. I hope this helps. As you're drafting, by all means, ask questions. I'm happy to help if I can. And best of luck, y'all. I'll be in touch.